Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. In today's special episode, we sat down with Rick Fisher, Senior Fellow at the International Assessment and Strategy Center. He touches on the recent media reports of China reportedly testing a hypersonic missile, the significance of it, what it means going forward, and the impact on the future. Let's dive in. Welcome, Rick. Thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you back on the show.
Tiffany, thanks for having me back.
So recently, the media has been abuzz about news of China reportedly testing a hypersonic missile. So why is this such a big deal?
Tiffany, it's a big deal for a number of reasons. China was accused by our Air Force Secretary back in August of having tested something called a fractional orbital bombardment system. This is a kind of weapon that the Soviet Union developed in the 1960s to defeat early American missile defense systems. What it involves is putting a warhead, a nuclear warhead, almost into orbit, but not quite completing the orbit, so that you can slow it down a little, and it comes down from orbit, and you actually have very little warning that it's going to strike, and you can send the missile and the warhead to the south. Most Soviet warheads would have come over the North Pole. The Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, or FOBS, was intended to come around under the South Pole and come up through Latin America against the United States, a region where we normally do not deploy long-range early warning radar. So we would have been taken by surprise on a number of counts. China doing this now raises a number of very important concerns, starting with China's intention to put nuclear weapons into space. This is banned, has been banned, and has been successfully banned under the 1967 United Nations Outer Space Treaty. China's intention, as demonstrated by this test, to put nuclear weapons into space violates this treaty, and also raises questions whether China will abide by any treaty in outer space, such as treaties governing the peaceful use of the moon. And that's very important because we plan to go to the moon, at least hopefully by 2024, and China intends to get there probably before 2030. And then there's the concern about the use of the hypersonic glide vehicle on this FOBS test. That's a very nifty, really unprecedented combination of technologies to combine the FOBS with a hypersonic glide vehicle, which is usually very maneuverable, and it's traveling at hypersonic speeds, so it's also very difficult to shoot down. And so China is potentially making an FOBS weapon that on top of that has a warhead that we can't even begin to know how to shoot down until we deploy our own weapons in space. Again, militarizing a region that nobody really wants to be festooned with traveling bombs and weapons and laser and energy weapons and the such. Now, China quickly after the Saturday Financial Times report made a statement on Monday to the effect that no, this was not some silly weapon. This was actually the test of a suborbital space plane. And the Chinese told the BBC as well that the test was in July. Well, in fact, yes, China did conduct a space plane test in July. The Chinese are trying to point to this actual test so that we don't ask questions about the real test. Now, the specific date for the real test has not yet been revealed. And I think we'll basically have to wait for future revelations from American sources, probably congressional testimony, to ascertain that important detail.
And so you mentioned earlier one of the surprising bits of this test was that it went over the South and then through Latin America, and that the U.S. doesn't have defense systems in place there. So can the U.S. detect this type of weapon? And if so, like, how can the U.S. defend itself?
Well, we have the means from outer space to monitor all Chinese missile launches in very fine detail, I might add. So we would be able to watch a large space launch vehicle being launched from the 4 existing Chinese space launch centers. They call them satellite launch centers. And with hyperspectral imaging, meaning basically the ability to very finely determine the heat signature of the rocket or vehicle, we could have a pretty good idea as to whether it carried a satellite or something larger, or maybe even a weapon. So that if we suspected that a Chinese FOBS weapon had been launched, were we to have actual interceptors, either laser interceptors or missile interceptors in orbit, it is possible that we could shoot the rocket down, shoot the missile down in its boost phase, when it's traveling really at its slowest speeds, and it's really the easiest to shoot it down. Now, we don't have these kinds of missile defenses in space. We've been arguing about doing that since the administration of Ronald Reagan, but we have not yet made the decision to put defensive systems in space that would protect Americans, not just from an FOBS strike, but from the broad range of nuclear-armed ICBMs pointed at us by Russia and China.
So do you see this report as maybe changing the U.S.'s stance towards actually incorporating this, or no?
I think this test will strengthen those within the Pentagon who have long been arguing for space-based missile defenses. During the last Trump administration, the Defense Department was taking steps to move in that direction by developing far more capable detection satellites, monitoring satellites, to improve our ability to monitor objects in space with additional satellites just for that purpose. And there was also much talk about finally making the decision to put actual defensive weapons in space as well. Not weapons that could attack other countries from outer space, but only attack the weapons that they launch at the United States.
And so some have been bringing up that this new system that China supposedly tested takes the best of a hypersonic cruise missile and a hypersonic glide vehicle. So how impactful is that?
Well, it would be very difficult. China already has hypersonic glide vehicle weapons, but they are deployed on medium-range boosters, so that the glide vehicle is only traveling maybe 5-6 times the speed of sound, maybe 7 times, but it doesn't leave the atmosphere. The weapon that was tested perhaps in July, perhaps in early August, actually had to re-enter the atmosphere, meaning that it had to have far higher tolerances. It had to be constructed of ablative materials that resist the heat of re-entry. And that would make the re-entry vehicle, hypersonic glide vehicle, more expensive to develop, more difficult to develop. So that China has actually done this is a big deal. And it's something that the United States doesn't have. Russia does have a hypersonic glide vehicle warhead that it puts on an ICBM. It would take a bit more work to turn that into a fractional orbital bombardment system, but Russia has hypersonic glide vehicle warheads that are maneuverable and very difficult to shoot down. China now has them that it can fire from a low Earth orbit and achieve more surprise and be more assured of hitting its target.
And some have also brought up that China's Dongfeng 6 program was shut down in the 70s due to technology lacking in funding, but that this new system in the FOB seems kind of similar. So is it a picking up of the old ways, or how do you see that?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. The Chinese scholars have told us that China had a FOBS program in the 1960s, especially after it found out about the Russian FOBS program that was actually quite a scandal in the United States at the time. Now, indeed, China probably revisited the old research, took the old research papers out of the files, and then built upon that work. The current system is more sophisticated than what the Russians were using in the 1960s. In the 1960s, the Russians did not have hypersonic glide vehicles. That China has combined a FOBS platform with a hypersonic glide vehicle warhead is a big deal. This is new and a very serious threat.
How does that change how the U.S. would defend against such a threat if it's new?
Well, when in the 1950s, when the United States felt that the Soviet Union was building up a large number of nuclear weapons and was going to use them in Europe to eliminate American and NATO conventional forces, to sweep them away for a general invasion of Europe. The United States came up with the strategy of developing smaller nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, so that when the main force was destroyed, Russia would still feel the retaliation of the shorter range tactical nuclear weapons on aircraft and missiles. This added a new layer of deterrence. It took away the assurance from the Soviet Union that a first strike might succeed. Today, with China's sprint toward nuclear warhead superiority and its development of FOBS weapons, the American nuclear arsenal is now facing an unprecedented threat. Again, sort of similar to the threat NATO faced in the 1950s. Probably the most efficient and effective answer then from the United States is to rebuild our theater nuclear forces, to make it clear to China and Russia that even a combined first strike would still earn them a very serious and destructive retaliatory strike from theater weapons. So that is probably the first thing that we should do. But the idea of developing space-based defenses is also long overdue. Ronald Reagan's dream was to make sure that Americans would not feel threatened by the nuclear weapons of the former Soviet Union or China. He did not believe that Americans should go through their lives with this fear. I believe that he was onto something. And by deploying missile defenses in space and rebuilding our theater nuclear systems, we can approach the dream of Ronald Reagan.
Now, speaking of the Soviet Union, back then there was the Sputnik moment, and some have been arguing the current missile test from China could count as a second Sputnik moment, while other experts say it's not. So what's your take on that?
It was indeed a surprise. Was it a Sputnik moment when technologies had been demonstrated that we had not yet mastered? No, no. If we wanted to develop our own FOBS weapons, we could do so very quickly and with little effort and not much expense. So it's not quite a Sputnik moment, but it is an escalation, a dangerous escalation in China's nuclear weapons capabilities. And we need to pay close attention to this, and we need to come up with a response. And if I were giving advice, it would be that we need to accelerate the rebuilding of our theater nuclear weapon systems so that our allies do not feel undefended, and that Russia and China face this second level of deterrence. I mean, the Chinese already have 2,000 theater missiles, 2,200 theater missiles deployed in Asia. We don't have any, except for non-nuclear Tomahawk cruise missiles on submarines. We need to really build up our theater missile forces in Asia. The Trump administration actually started to do that. And it does not appear that the Biden administration is canceling those plans, but also it's not accelerating those plans either.
And so Russia, China, a lot of these countries have all been in this race. But what about other ones, like, say, North Korea? Do they have something that could also compete?
Indeed, North Korea does have its own hypersonic glide vehicle technology. On September 29, the North Koreans tested a medium-range booster armed with a hypersonic glide vehicle. The first images that came out on September 29 and September 30 were vague. We really couldn't tell the character of this HGV hypersonic glide vehicle. But then on October 11, North Korea held its first major arms exhibition. And in that exhibition, they revealed far more detailed images of their hypersonic glide vehicle. And there are just too many similarities between the North Korean hypersonic glide vehicle and China's HGV on its DF-17 medium-range missile to warrant a conclusion that China very likely helped North Korea with this weapon. HGVs can extend the range of a booster by up to 40%. So for North Korea, this means that it can build cheaper, medium, and maybe intermediate range boosters, arm them with the HGV warhead, and they can still hit the United States.
And so you mentioned the glide vehicle having some similarities to, say, the Chinese army. So what are some of these similarities?
Well, if you look at a comparison of the two HGVs, the North Korean HGV and the DF-17 HGV, you would think that they sit around the same family table for dinner. Their similarities are just too numerous to discount. The fins are about the same. The horizontal fin structure is the same. A very exacting aerodynamic shape around that horizontal fin structure. It's practically identical between the two warheads. And also you have the neck, if you will, that connects the hypersonic glide vehicle to the booster. Again, something that has to be aerodynamically perfect. And the neck on both the North Korean and the Chinese missiles are almost the same. So as China has been helping North Korea acquire nuclear missile technology, it's been selling the trucks to carry North Korea's missiles. If you are building a truck to carry a certain large missile, then you have to know everything about that missile. And so it's very logical to me that if China is building trucks for North Korean missiles, it's probably also helping North Korea to develop and build these missiles, if not building them themselves. And this is very much I view the HGV program as a continuation of long-standing Chinese technical assistance to North Korea's missile programs.
And so with China, say, helping either share this information or by making them themselves, do you see the U.S. doing a similar thing in the opposite way of helping allies build up their defenses?
Well, the big question now for the United States to respond to this just burgeoning North Korean missile arsenal, and now the burgeoning Chinese nuclear missile arsenal, the real question here is whether the United States should redeploy tactical nuclear weapons in Asia. In 1991, President George H.W. Bush withdrew those weapons because the Cold War had ended as a gesture of peace. But our adversaries had no intention of responding likewise to and strengthening an era of peace, they started programs that allowed them to build these new weapons. China wants to be the world's hegemon. In order to do so, it has to have the world's largest nuclear arsenal. It also needs to have its allies nuclear armed so that the Americans can either be distracted by them or at a minimum, be deterred from attacking them. So at a minimum, the United States has to level the playing field. And the first thing that we can do is go back to our allies, defense treaty allies, South Korea and Japan, and say, look, we can't do this without nuclear weapons anymore. Can we start a new phase in our defense relationship in which we cooperatively base these weapons in your country, like we've done with some of our NATO allies since the 1950s? Belgium, Germany, Italy, and Turkey. We've co-based tactical nuclear bombs since the 1950s, and by co-basing, what that means is if American aircraft are rendered incapable of carrying these weapons, destroyed, then the aircraft of the host country has the ability, and the pilot has the training to deliver these same weapons. That's a kind of equal relationship. It's not a completely equal relationship, but it's one that allows the ally to have some control. And we've actually reached that point in our military relationship with both South Korea, Japan, and even Australia. Nuclear weapons are a bit more controversial in Australia. Well, they're controversial in Japan as well. Although in South Korea, opinion polls are very supportive of reintroducing American tactical nuclear weapons. So we should do that. If the South Koreans are in agreement, well, probably the Japanese won't be too far behind, and the Australians will probably follow suit as well. So with American tactical nuclear weapons back in Asia, I mean, we could also put them on submarines. We could deploy them on other warships as well. But having the support of an ally in this redeployment is also crucial. So we should be approaching our allies and get their agreement that it's time to reintroduce these weapons as well.
Well, thank you so much, Rick, for joining us today. Great to have you on the show.
Tiffany, thank you.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's special episode with Rick Fisher. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.